Barbra Streisand started reading the note. At the third line, she stopped. And Jimmy Fallon couldn't find a single word. The Tonight Show. March 2024. Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Cameras rolling. 300 audience members. Millions watching from home. Another Wednesday night of laughter and celebrity interviews and viral moments designed to trend on social media by morning. Jimmy Fallon sat behind his desk in his signature suit, that familiar smile on his face as he introduced his next guest. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Barbra Streisand." The audience erupted. The Roots played. Barbra walked onto the stage in an elegant outfit, waving to the crowd, that iconic presence filling the studio the way it had filled concert halls and movie theaters for 6 decades. She hugged Jimmy. She sat in the guest chair. The interview began exactly as planned, funny anecdotes about her new memoir, stories from her legendary career, the easy banter between a consummate professional and a host who'd grown up idolizing her. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly what television should be. Until a production assistant walked onto the stage carrying a small envelope. Jimmy noticed first. His eyes followed the PA as she approached Barbra's chair, leaned down, and whispered something before handing over the envelope. It wasn't part of the show. It wasn't scripted. The cameras kept rolling, but the control room went into immediate alert mode. Barbra took the envelope, her expression shifting from polite confusion to something else, as the PA whispered again. Barbra nodded, her hand trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside was a single handwritten note on cream-colored stationery. "I'm sorry," Barbra said, looking at Jimmy with an expression he'd never seen on her face before, completely unguarded, vulnerable. "I need to read this. Right now. On camera. Is that okay?" Jimmy glanced at the cameras, at the control room window where producers were frantically gesturing, then back at Barbra. Something in her voice told him this mattered more than any segment, any joke, any planned moment. "Of course," he said. "Take your time." Barbra held the note with both hands. She took a breath. And she began to read aloud. "Dear Miss Streisand, you don't know me, but 47 years ago, you saved my mother's life." The studio went quiet. Barbra continued, her voice steady but her hands shaking. "My mother was 19 years old in 1977. She was in a psychiatric hospital in Philadelphia after a suicide attempt. She'd lost her parents in a car accident 6 months earlier. She had no siblings. No family. She wanted to die." Jimmy's smile was completely gone. He sat perfectly still, both hands gripping the edge of his desk. "One night," Barbra read, "a nurse brought a record player into the common room. She played your album A Star Is Born. My mother heard you sing Evergreen. And something happened." Jimmy stopped mid-smile. The entire studio froze. Barbra paused. She looked up from the note, tears already forming in her eyes. Should I keep going?" "Please," Jimmy whispered. She returned to the note, her voice thicker now. "She told me this story 1,000 times growing up. She said that when she heard your voice singing those words, love, soft as an easy chair, something inside her remembered what it felt like to want to live. Not that night. Not immediately. But it was the first crack in the darkness." The audience was completely silent. 300 people holding their collective breath. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 47 years earlier, in a psychiatric ward in Philadelphia that no longer exists. The woman's name was Ellen Morrison. 19 years old. Orphaned. Broken. Sitting in a room with 15 other patients, most of them decades older, all of them lost in their own private hells. The night nurse, whose name Ellen never learned, had brought in an old record player and a stack of albums from her personal collection. Music therapy, she called it, though the hospital had no official program. Just a kind woman who believed sound could reach places words couldn't. She put on Barbra Streisand's soundtrack to A Star Is Born, the album that was dominating the charts, winning awards, playing in every home in America. Ellen Morrison had been sitting in the corner, knees pulled to her chest, staring at nothing. She'd stopped speaking 3 days earlier. The doctors were discussing electroshock therapy. They'd given up on talk therapy, on medication, on everything else. But when Barbara's voice filled that sterile room, singing about love being soft as an easy chair, about feelings coming back again, Ellen's head lifted. Just slightly. Just enough. The nurse noticed. She played the song again. And again. And by the fourth playing, Ellen was crying, the first emotion she'd shown since her suicide attempt. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Ellen Morrison spent 7 more months in that hospital. She was released in 1978. She got a job at a library. She went back to school. She became a social worker specializing in grief counseling for young adults who'd lost parents. In 1983, she met a man named David Chen at a bereavement support group where she was facilitating. He'd lost his wife to cancer. They married 2 years later. In 1987, they had a daughter. They named her Barbara, spelled with 3 A's. A quiet tribute to the singer whose voice had pulled Ellen back from the edge. Ellen never tried to contact Barbra Streisand. What would she say? How do you thank someone for saving your life when they never knew you existed? When they were just singing a song in a recording studio, completely unaware that those notes would travel through space and time to reach a suicidal teenager in a Philadelphia psychiatric ward? But Ellen told her daughter the story. Over and over. Barbara Chen grew up knowing that her mother was alive because Barbra Streisand had recorded Evergreen in 1976. That she existed because of a voice on a record player in a hospital common room. Barbara became a music therapist. She specialized in working with psychiatric patients. She played Barbra Streisand's music in her sessions. She'd seen it work, not always, not with everyone, but enough times to believe in the power of sound to reach the unreachable. 3 weeks ago, Ellen Morrison Chen died. Peacefully, at 73, in her sleep. She'd lived a full life. She'd helped hundreds of grieving young people find their way back to living. She'd been a wife, a mother, a grandmother. At her funeral, Barbara stood to give the eulogy. She told the story of the psychiatric ward and the record player and Evergreen. She told it the way her mother had told it, with reverence for the mysterious ways that art can save lives. After the service, Barbara made a decision. She would find a way to tell Barbra Streisand what her voice had done. Not for gratitude, not for closure, but because her mother would have wanted the story told. Because somewhere, Barbra Streisand should know that she'd saved a life without ever knowing it. Barbara wrote the note on her mother's personal stationery. She called the Tonight Show's production office. She explained that Barbara was scheduled to appear, that she had something important to share, that it needed to happen on camera so the world could understand what art can do. A sympathetic producer listened. Against all protocol, against every rule about surprise guests and unplanned moments, they agreed to deliver the note. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Barbara was still reading the note aloud, her voice breaking now, tears streaming down her face. "My mother died 3 weeks ago," she read. "At her funeral, I told this story. And I realized that you never knew. You never knew that on some random day in 1976, when you recorded that song, you were also saving a 19-year-old girl's life. You were giving her a reason to wake up the next morning. You were giving her a future." Barbara stopped. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the note. She looked at Jimmy, who had tears running down his face, his professional composure completely shattered. "There's more," Barbara whispered. "Keep going," Jimmy managed. She returned to the note, barely able to speak now. "Because of you, my mother lived. Because of you, she became a social worker who saved other people's lives. Because of you, she met my father. Because of you, I exist. Because of you, I became a music therapist who has helped hundreds of patients find their way back from darkness. The audience was openly crying now. Questlove had his head in his hands. A camera operator was wiping tears while trying to keep the shot steady. I'm sitting in the audience tonight. Barbara read, her voice barely audible. Row 7, seat 12. I wanted you to know that when you sing, somewhere in the world, someone is choosing to live. Thank you for being the reason my mother chose life. Thank you for being the reason I exist. The note was signed, Barbara Chen, daughter of Ellen Morrison Chen. Living proof that art saves lives. Barbara lowered the note. She looked out at the audience, scanning row 7 until she found a young woman in her mid-30s, Asian American, tears streaming down her face, one hand raised in a small wave. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Barbra Streisand stood up. Without asking permission, without checking with producers, without following any protocol. She walked off the stage, down the steps, into the audience. The cameras scrambled to follow. Jimmy stood up behind his desk, watching in stunned silence. Barbara reached row 7. She stood in front of Barbara Chen, who was trembling, hands over her mouth, unable to believe this was happening. Your mother, Barbara said, her voice thick with emotion. What was her name? Ellen, Barbara managed. Ellen Morrison Chen. Ellen, Barbara repeated, as if committing it to memory. I need you to know something. In my entire career, 60 years of recording, performing, making films, no one has ever told me that my voice saved their life. I've won awards. I've sold millions of records. But this is the only thing that's ever really mattered. She pulled Barbara into an embrace. The studio erupted. Not in applause yet, but in that collective sound of 300 people witnessing something sacred. Jimmy walked out from behind his desk. He approached the edge of the stage, looking down at Barbara and Barbara holding each other in the audience. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the one he used to jot down joke ideas, interview questions, random thoughts. He always carried it. It was his most personal possession as a performer. He walked down the steps into the audience. He approached Barbara and Barbara, still embracing. Barbara, Jimmy said softly, I want you to have this. She looked at him, confused, pulling back from Barbara slightly. Jimmy held out the notebook. I write in this every day. Jokes, ideas, moments I want to remember. Your mother's story, what you just shared, it needs to be remembered. Write it down. In your own words. Keep this notebook. And someday, when your own children ask you about their grandmother, show them this. Show them where you wrote down the night you told the world how Barbra Streisand saved your family. Barbara took the notebook with shaking hands. I can't, this is yours. It's more yours than mine now, Jimmy said, his voice breaking. Some stories are bigger than notebooks. Bigger than television. This is one of them. The audience stood. All of them. The Roots started playing, Evergreen, softly, gently, Questlove brushing the drums with the kind of reverence usually reserved for churches. Barbara and Barbara stood together in the audience, arms around each other, while Jimmy stood beside them, all three of them crying, while 300 strangers and millions watching at home bore witness to the moment when art and life and gratitude became one thing. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The show didn't continue its normal segments. Jimmy invited Barbara onto the stage. They talked for 20 minutes. No jokes, no games, just conversation about Ellen, about music therapy, about the mysterious ways that sound can save lives. Barbara sang Evergreen, live. Not the polished performance version. Raw. Intimate. Looking directly at Barbara Chen while she sang every word. When she finished, there was no applause. Just silence. The kind of silence that holds more meaning than any sound. Jimmy stood at the edge of the stage, the empty notebook space in his pocket a reminder that some things matter more than jokes. After the show, Barbara asked for Barbara's address. She sent her the original handwritten sheet music to Evergreen, with a note. For Ellen, who heard it when she needed it most. Barbara still carries Jimmy's notebook. She's filled it with stories about her mother. Stories she now shares with the psychiatric patients she works with, proof that choosing life is always worth it. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Jimmy Fallon never mentioned the notebook on air again. But in every interview since that night, when asked about his most memorable moment, he tells the story of the note, the daughter, and the night television remembered what it was really for. The notebook sits on Barbara's desk, next to her mother's photograph, next to the sheet music. 3 objects that prove art doesn't just entertain. Sometimes it saves lives.